coronavirus.
Cries echo between Wuhan's high-rise flats. The residents in lockdown are shouting a message of encouragement across the spaces. Add oil. It means keep up the fight. How China has waged that fight has exposed strengths and weaknesses of the world's second superpower. It's not just a medical crisis, it's a political one. Over the next half an hour, I'll be asking whether the epidemic has threatened China's all-powerful one-party system or strengthened it.
I think China as a whole, including the Chinese government and the Chinese people, have been doing an unprecedented, heroic struggle against the coronavirus.
As the world watches China recover, the virus lingers in the body politic. Some won't get over it.
We all know who should be blamed. Too many people are infected. The Chinese government don't even allow people to tell the truth. And they don't tell the truth as well. I don't know who I can trust.
The virus spread from a Wuhan market selling wild creatures for meat around the time of the Spring Festival, which should be the happiest time of the year, when the TV is full of cheery variety shows and billions crisscross the country to visit friends and relations to celebrate. But as the dark news and the disease itself spread out from Hubei province, for one man in Wuhan, a nightmare was beginning. We're calling him Mr. Ding. He wanted to tell the BBC his story, but didn't want us to use his name. His 65-year-old mother fell ill, short of breath, tired, coughing, and her flat was on the 4th floor of a building with no lifts, and there were no ambulances either. He's in and aggrieved.
From the beginning to the end, my sister drove her to hospital, but I carried her on my back, because you can't drive up the stairs. It was me carrying her on my back down the building and in the hospital. When she couldn't walk, I carried her in. Because it's a lung sickness, each single movement made her pant heavily for minutes.
For 8 days he trekked from hospital to hospital, getting some treatment after queuing for hours, a drip here, oxygen there, but never a bed. Mr. Ding was so concerned by the state of one hospital, he secretly filmed its accident and emergency department. There's one shot of a dead body lying wrapped on a bed, and the corridors are pretty crowded. His mother was too frightened to go back there, so again they went from hospital to hospital. The road to one was blocked. Security stopped them entering another. Yet another they queued behind 80 people and still got no treatment. At a 4th hospital she was put on a drip for 4 hours, but then sent home to her own bed, up those 4 flights of stairs, again on her son's back. He was furious with the officials who were meant to help.
I swore at the community leaders. You sons of bitches, you always shirk from your duty. They said the problem is with the higher level. It's our boss's problem. They didn't tell me who exactly. They just said the higher levels mess it all up. I said, arseholes, it's not your families who are dying. You cheat on us every day. How many more people have to die before you do something?
Mrs. Li also lives in Wuhan. She was hearing so many rumours about this new disease, and then her 5-year-old son came down with a fever, followed by almost all her family.
It was at the beginning of the outbreak. Supplies hadn't reached us yet. I felt that was the end of my world. No one was capable of offering help. Patients and their families were panicky. Many thought the disease was incurable. People were full of fear. It wasn't just us. Back then the medical were in a panic too.
But now they're all completely recovered, and she's full of praise for the treatment they got.
People's behaviour has been so touching. Really. Thanks to the country, thanks to the people. What happened in Wuhan really deeply touched me. The country really made great efforts, great sacrifices. I truly think our country has done a great job this time.
Sad stories, bad stories, as well as happy endings, will happen in any system. But China is not any system, and it's changed a lot recently. Since President Xi Jinping came to power 8 years ago, he's gradually increased his own authority, tightened censorship and control. People are more careful about what they're willing to say these days. Xi has made himself the paramount leader, no longer a mere first among equals. And that made coronavirus not just a crisis, but a defining moment. Jeremy Goldkorn is editor of the SupChina news website.
This is a huge test for Xi, as we know, because he himself said it was a test of China's governance system. And this is the first time since I have been involved with China, which goes back to 1995 when I first moved to Beijing, that I have seen such widespread discontent with government handling of a particular issue. It reminds me a little bit of the Wenzhou train crash of 2011, but perhaps because that was an event that started and finished and only affected a limited amount of people, it was nowhere near the feeling of uncertainty about the government's competence that seems to be emerging now. So I believe this is an enormous challenge for Xi, but it's one that the Communist Party has historically proven quite good at dealing with these challenges. So it may be a big challenge, but I would not predict the end of the Communist Party's rule by any means.
One story from Wuhan in particular caught the public imagination. At the end of last year, in December, a 33-year-old doctor, Li Wenliang, spotted that patients were falling ill with a new disease. He warned other medics of a potential outbreak of a SARS-like infection. Police hauled him in and presented him with a document.
The law enforcement agency wants you to cooperate, listen to the police and stop your illegal behaviour. Can you do that?
I can, Li wrote.
If you insist on your views, refuse to repent and continue the illegal activity, you will be punished by the law. Do you understand?
I understand, Li wrote. And having agreed to toe the line, he returned to work at the hospital, treating the disease he had accurately, but illegally, tried to warn about. And then he died of it himself. Social media erupted in grief and anger.
He's the hero of China. He told people the truth.
Kerry Allen monitors Chinese social media for the BBC.
I was quite surprised because they were leaving candle emojis, which are ways of marking respects for when someone's died, about Li Wenliang. And there was just so much anger. I mean, the fact that he tried to warn people about this, and that was really, really clear. And then there was a lot of confusion about when he died because official media reported it. And then they said, oh, actually, they removed their earlier posts and said he's still in critical condition, and then announced a few hours later that he died. There was a real sense then that the government media just didn't, they weren't communicating properly to the people. So I was seeing on all platforms just so much kind of real fear and anxiety for this doctor who died, who tried to warn people about this huge problem, and just so much anger for the government that they couldn't communicate his death properly.
The protesters on social media, who called themselves the Digital Resistance, played cat and mouse with the authorities. Censors scrubbed their comments. They reposted them. This all goes to the heart of a problem. There's an instinct for secrecy and cover-up, so as not to fall foul of the all-powerful big bosses in Beijing. An Oxford professor of the history of modern China, Rana Mitter, says that reveals wider issues around trust.
The death of Dr. Li Wenliang became a real issue on Chinese social media, on Weixin and Weibo, for a few days until the censors, the so-called 50-cent gang, which basically means that they're being paid a small commission payment each time they scrub something embarrassing off the internet on behalf of the Chinese state. Until they came along, essentially there seemed to be a lot of genuine, deep-rooted anger on the part of China's netizens, as the online commentators are known. And the reason is, in a sense, quite simple. It's about access to information. China's wider population have a trust problem. China has grown very, very fast in terms of its economy and in terms of technology and its standing in the world. There's no doubt that it's really grown very fast in a short time. But people feel that social bonds, in some senses, are being loosened up. People don't know quite whether they can trust the food that they buy in the supermarket to be safe, or whether if someone invites them to invest in a scheme, it might be a Ponzi scheme or some sort of fraud. So doctors become, in a sense, a source of sort of solid knowledge. And when one of those figures is seen to have tried to alert people to an emerging crisis, and then actually, in a sort of rather tragic tale, died from exposure to the disease, that puts up two sources of authority in society up against one another: doctors, who people trust because of their training, and the party, which wants to be trusted, but in this case is felt to have slipped up.
The police handling of Dr. Li Wenliang's use of the WeChat message was a mistake.
That's Victor Gao, once an interpreter for leader Deng Xiaoping. He's now director of the China National Association of International Studies and an outspoken supporter of the communist system.
That's why he's being hailed as a national hero, and the police in Wuhan city or any other parts of China need to learn, while they have a job to do, they also need to respect the professionals and people's right to speak freely and to avoid doing anything which may actually serve to muzzle the people when they actually have legitimate needs to express themselves. I think this is one area that China is learning a big lesson, and we as a society need to move on to a better tomorrow in dealing with opinions, for example, and expressions.
So you do think there will be fairly big political changes as a result of this disease?
In a situation like this, my personal view, you do not need to turn every piece of before you need to wave the red flag to the people about the potential danger of this epidemic, or now we call it pandemic. And I think people in any part of China need to know the truth earlier in the process.
In the end, I think that the result for the Chinese Communist Party would not be a drive towards more democracy. I think that's very unlikely. But it might have to be a drive towards more transparency in the system, where people feel more confident that they know what is actually going on.
We've reached a pivot point in our story. After chaos and cover-up, the Central Communist Party got a grip. First isolating Wuhan, then other cities, then locking down just about the entire nation of 1.4 billion people. And not just that, but rigorous comprehensive testing on trains, to buildings. Those found positive weren't just sent home, but straight to quarantine in special fever centres. President Xi called it the biggest health emergency the nation had ever faced, but Kerry Allen says he didn't quite take the lead.
One of the things that I noticed very early on is that Xi Jinping appointed his deputy Li Keqiang as kind of, the man in command of tackling this virus, and he'd been missing for some time, and it was very clear that they didn't have a clear government line yet on his role in tackling this. And I think there was a lot of fear. And one of the things that a lot of China specialists, other than myself, we talk about is there's this concept of the deputy always being the fall guy. And when he was placed in charge of tackling the coronavirus, we were thinking this is the biggest fall guy in China.
Rana Mitter.
It does seem to have diminished his capacity to claim that he is the supreme leader and that nobody else matters. He's had to send the Prime Minister of China, Li Keqiang, out to parts of China where the virus is really raging. He's essentially given him the same position that Donald Trump has given Mike Pence in the US system, making his second in command the person who's the face of dealing with the crisis. And that, of course, does confer authority on the Prime Minister's shoulders. So there's more of a sense of moving away from being the supreme leader and perhaps back to the more traditional first among equals sense that we had with previous Chinese leaders, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. I suspect that one of the reasons that Li Keqiang, the Prime Minister, has been given such a prominent position in terms of the public face of the crisis is that Xi Jinping has had to weigh up whether or not his narrative, which is about conquest over problems, whether it's China's poverty levels or whether it's technology or whether it's standing up to the United States, can really also be effective in the face of a particular problem, a virus, which really even the Chinese Communist Party can't control. So to that extent, I think it's partly about damage limitation on the narrative. If things go well, then essentially Li is part of the top leadership and he can be made part of that wider narrative of conquest over the disease. If there's a second wave or if things don't go so well, then Xi has essentially separated himself from the problem.
And there were problems. When an official delegation visited Wuhan and were shown round a compound, they were greeted by shouts of derision from the flats above. Jeremy Goldkorn.
Cell phone video footage circulated of residents screaming, "This is all fake, this is all fake," suggesting that they were very aware that the Communist Party is upping its propaganda and promoting the idea that they have successfully handled the virus, where many people don't feel that that is actually the case. The central government has done its usual trick of blaming local officials for everything that went wrong. And this is a tried and tested method of Chinese government that predates the Communist Party. All of the bungling in the early days of the epidemic has been blamed on local officials, and Xi Jinping himself is being portrayed as a wise leader who has heroically saved the country from this terrible epidemic.
There was a sense amongst people that the local government in Hubei province was waiting on the upper chair of command and they weren't getting anywhere. And it was a case of, well, when something like this is happening quite quickly, maybe you do need just to make a decision.
If people in Wuhan were blaming local officials, they weren't the only ones. There's a Chinese expression, throwing woks, which means throw the blame around. In earlier years, Xi had launched an anti-corruption campaign, promising to catch both tigers and flies, the bigwigs as well as the little guys. But now the high-ups blamed the locals. The mayor of Hubei was sacked. Rana Mitter.
It's a very common tactic that's used by Chinese officials and also officials in a lot of authoritarian societies to basically say that local government made mistakes, committed errors that actually would have been spotted if the top level had known about them. And that's a good way of making sure that the very top leadership don't get tainted by the idea that they're not totally in charge of what's going on, even though it does suggest that maybe they don't have the information that they ought to have. It has to be said that many of those local officials are not all that keen on being scapegoated. Certainly, there seem to have been statements by the party secretary of Wuhan City, which, of course, was the source of the outbreak, that even though he formally had to apologize, that he rather felt that he had been thrown into the soup on something that simply was a case of him actually obeying orders from above, not to create a panic and therefore to try and suppress rumours of what turned out to be true.
This is what few in China are willing or able to say. It may well be the local officials who screwed up, but it's often their fear of the bosses in Beijing, fear of being blamed and punished, which drives the failure in the first place. Jeremy Goldkorn.
It seems very clear that local health officials try to essentially cover up the information about the outbreak because they were scared of getting in trouble with their superiors, essentially. But once the central government got involved and started to act, it's difficult to fault most of what they did. The measures they've taken are draconian by Western standards, but they seem to have proved to be very effective.
Will that pacify the widespread anger over the initial handling of the outbreak? And will Chinese people question the very system itself? The man we're calling Mr. Ding certainly does. He's the individual who tried to help his desperately sick mother. After 8 days looking for a hospital bed, he finally found one.
When she was moved to that bed, she was okay, but right after we finished work, the machine by had started beeping, which had all ran inside. After half an hour, they told me my mum's died. When she passed away, I just couldn't bear it. I cried silently. The doctor warned me, in a kind way, don't cry. If you cry, you'll contract the virus. I couldn't hold in my feelings. I went out, got into the car and cried for a very long time. My mum didn't even count as a confirmed case till she died.
Mr. Ding sees his mother's death as a failure of the Chinese government.
I wanted to do this interview because my experience means I don't believe in our government anymore. They cheat on us every day. Those figures on the news every day are all fake. Some say it's a natural disaster, but actually it's a disaster caused by humans. Why are they still covering it up? They just want to hide their criminal deeds. Why did they not dare to tell the truth? How evil they are. Sons of bitches.
COVID-19 raised the political temperature for a few critical weeks, and the view of some will have been changed forever by the experience. But by the beginning of March, there was a sure sign that the leadership at least felt the worst of the crisis. And Kerry Allen says social media had a news story.
Xi Jinping was becoming more and more in the limelight. So suddenly he was making more public appearances, he was appearing in newspapers, and he was actually himself going out into the streets of Beijing wearing a mask and talking to locals. And people were seeing him then in the spotlight. I mean, there were questions amongst people of where's he been? How come he's taken so long to appear? But obviously the Chinese government has had a long track record of being able to control people's discussions about this. And one of the things that you'll have is in China what's known as the 50 Cent Party, who are people who are paid a small amount of money to post messages in line with the government's message. And they were kind of, they can work from home. They can post messages that are positive and in line with the government. So they were able to do it more so and more effectively. So they were posting messages off the back of Xi Jinping appearing in media and saying, oh, it's great, great to see Xi doing this. And this is all that people were seeing. They were seeing so much of this, just people, they believe genuine commenters getting very enthusiastic about Xi having this under control.
In Victor Gao's mind, the president's visit to the city at the centre of the crisis, still in lockdown, capped this.
You see President Xi Jinping really calling the shots and sparing no resources and leaving no stone unturned. And the fact that he made a personal trip to Wuhan, meeting with the medical staffs, for example, community workers and the general population, to thank them for their great sacrifices, to thank them for their great work, etc. I think this is really very touching and very moving. I think that people now fully realize that this President Xi Jinping really cares about the lives of the Chinese people, and he really wants to do a good job in saving the Chinese people.
Even as China starts to return to something like normal in a world which feels for the rest of us very far from normal, the damage to its economy is still profound. For months, factories have been closed down, production halted. The impact on all our societies will be dramatic. But there's a more profound question for China and its ruling Communist Party.
Absolutely. It's almost a cliche of journalism that there's been an unwritten bargain, an unspoken bargain between the people and the government, that in exchange for limits on their freedom, the government will give the people economic prosperity. And, to a large extent, that cliche is true. And if the economic prosperity ends, things might look very different. Also, one has to bear in mind that people born in the 80s have never known a time when there hasn't been really rather remarkable economic growth. They've never known a time when next year isn't pretty much bound to be better than last year. So even a slowdown in growth is going to have an interesting effect on public opinion about the government, I believe.
One outcome may be a huge boost to the foreign policy face China wants to show the world, that of a benevolent elder brother, keen on cooperation, in their favoured party phrase, win-win. Not determined to prove the superiority of their system, more subtle than that, but that Western democracy is no longer either an inevitable future or naturally dominant. Here's Jeremy Goldkorn again.
The government has done its best to whip up nationalism and particularly anti-Americanism. They've nodded and winked and encouraged conspiracy theories. Aside from a booming economy, that is the other tool that the Communist Party has in its toolbox of control, is whipping up nationalism.
Rana Mitter.
One of the factors that is still very much in play is what the coronavirus crisis will have done to the Chinese sense of identity, and particularly nationalist identity, more broadly speaking. Certainly many elements of China's growing sense of national pride and sometimes often a more national assertiveness are going to remain very much the same. The question will be whether or not the party can tell the story of the defeat of the coronavirus as part of what is perhaps the newest but very potent element in that Chinese nationalist story, and that's about China as a techno-power. China's wider population, not just the leadership, already very proud of the fact that, for good or ill, people do have a lot of regard for the way in which China has developed artificial intelligence, virtual reality, 5G, Huawei, a very good example of that there. If it can be shown that in terms of vaccine development and also dealing with and conquering an epidemic, Chinese authorities can portray their treatment of the virus as ultimately being a success, and there is quite a lot beginning to emerge in the Chinese press about, obviously controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, about their triumph over the coronavirus, then it will actually be painted by Xi as a vindication of his style of rule. In other words, authoritarian, swift-moving, and ultimately more effective at treating a sudden unexpected outbreak of disease than the much more chaotic, as he would argue, democratic systems in the liberal world.
Even as we've been making this programme in a rapidly changing world, China's story has been evolving too. Certainly, the way the virus was covered up in the first place exposed deep flaws in the system, and this trauma encouraged dissatisfaction to flare into a rare expression of discontent with the system itself. But there's been an equally swift transition from the perception of China as a pariah, the author of all our misfortunes, to allow it to pose as a potential saviour, benevolent and benign. Without a doubt, this argument for a moral and cultural superiority will play into another great story of our age, the rivalry between two superpowers, the USA and China, a rebalancing that's likely to be hastened and sharpened by life and death in the time of coronavirus.
That was Mark Mardell with China and the